Welcome to Portals of Perception and to our third exploration with Layman Pascal, an author, a shamanic artist and explorer, a spiritual teacher and guide, and the voice of the integral stage. In part one, which we called Protecting the Sacred, we reflected on the search for wisdom and the need to embrace all sources of insight and intelligence at a time when cultural and existential crises threaten the well-being of our global community. We asked, how do we integrate 21st century technology side by side with ancient and sacred traditions? And how do we weave and merge the intuitive, the analytical, the spiritual, and the scientific? The premise in this is that real embodied transformation, personal and collective, needs a fuller integration of multiple approaches where contemplative practices and personal development can shape and guide the systems and structures we are building. In part two, titled Pursuing Integral Wisdom, we reflected on the vast body of work of the Integral Stage YouTube channel. My sense of today is that we want to slow down the conversation to get a sense of this moment in time and build on these earlier conversations. And if we get to reflect, Layman, on some of your earlier work, the metaphysics of adjacency and the integral surplus model. Layman, welcome.
Very nice to be here, Aviv. Good to see you again.
So we have also recorded in parallel a conversation for the integral stage, which we called the fifth quadrant, where we took 2 hours to build step by step a loom of discovery. Let me actually, just for reference, bring it up on screen for a second. It looked like that. And this was a journey where we literally asked where to begin, journeyed through the 3 purposes of wisdom traditions and mystery schools, reflected on the Eastern and Western orientations, the rise of the intellect, some of the influential teachers in the early 20th century, and then essentially brought the inquiry to what we are gesturing in the idea of the fifth quadrant, in search of the more than human, the causing and the blessing realms on the leading edge of the evolutionary inquiry, where we seek to find the source code and the energetic lift that potentially can help us address the wicked problems of the meta crisis. And we codified 12 moves, and I have had in my thoughts a way that we were going to come back to this and what we were going to build, and things have changed over the last several months. And so this is where I have a sense that today is an open inquiry, a search to discover what's emerging at this point in time. And I would like to try to describe at a very high level what brought me to suggesting this inquiry into the fifth quadrant, where we landed then, what I initially thought were going to be the next moves, what has happened since that got us mixed up a bit, or me mixed up in the vortex of a new work that I feel is rewiring me, and also place these inside what I see to be the 2 big overarching inquiries that bring your work with the integral stage, what we're doing at Portals, and actually many other brilliant voices all over the world, in terms of the developmental inquiry and the evolutionary epochal inquiry, and how they cross-fertilize and unlock each other, and place these inside our dialogue and see where we want to go. But so before I bring some of those additional artifacts or elements, let me make space to bring your voice and just ask you what's alive for you, what's catching your attention. Where am I catching up with you right now? I think you're somewhere in escaped the Canadian winter or spring to some warmer weather. What is catching your attention and what is quivering in your universe?
Yeah, it's early morning in Tulum, Mexico. This is my final day here. I've been staying with some friends. I'll be back in Canada tonight. What I'm seeing, feeling, hearing, quivering, couple of things. A lot of people are talking to me about Christianity, but not only Christianity, a kind of return and reevaluation of mythic religion and tradition and how that fits in with the leading edge fields. I think there's been a lot of interest around the Limicon event and what that meant and whether it's going to change anything in the field. There's a lot of, I noticed on your summary image of the fifth quadrant presentation, all of the example wisdom teachers were men. And I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of feelings about the role of women and of the feminine in what we're doing and how we're moving forward. I'm seeing and participating in a lot of experiments where people are trying to do collective sensing into what might be the presence of new archetypes for the field. And I think there's a shift from big name authors and philosophical thinkers to a more distributed, more felt, more embodied sensibility, which I really appreciate. And a shift, kind of a strength is building up, I would say. And that strength is expressed in a willingness to take on difficult topics and difficult people. And by that, by difficult topics, I mean personal issues in your life. I mean money. I mean sexuality. I mean anxiety. I mean the acknowledgement openly of our various neuroses and things like that. And by difficult people, I mean the people who are provocative and polarizing and are in or adjacent to these fields, but are not perfect human beings and may have done things that many of us don't like. And how do we fold in people who are causing turbulence socially in the field wherever they go? But to me, like I say, all of that is a very positive sign because it suggests that we are feeling confident enough to go into those areas and start to struggle with things that are provocative to us.
So the shift to bring forward and more recognize and embrace the feminine voice and the feminine principle in the bigger unfolding process, the shift from singular, larger than life pedestaled voices to a more distributed kind of engagement where there are different voices at different times. It's through different facilitative functions that may, at different configurational situations, be the point of leadership. So leadership more as something that is emerging through different archetypes rather than singularly fashioned with one person. And thirdly, the shift to more fully embrace the difficult, the provocative, the challenging, the shadow, what I also we are describing as the ghost elements, and bring those forward because they unlock transformational, healing, and evolutionary potential. All these three moves map very powerfully with the kind of experience that I am seeing, and also with what we were gesturing to in terms of the inquiry of the fifth quadrant. In many ways, that inquiry was an attempt to invite certain corrective moves. So anything else you'd offer in terms of what else are you seeing on the leading edge? What else would you emphasize in there. You mentioned also the Christian conversation. I think I know where that is sourced. Pick that on the liminal web. So, but anything else you'll highlight?
Well, I would dig into that one a little bit more because the Christian conversation, even though a couple of people have provoked that conversation, it's really touched on an open question, which is how we deal with um, the old forms of community organization that might still be necessary going forward. And very importantly, how we deal with what strikes the modern consciousness as irrational behavior, right? So that could be mythic tradition, it could be the subconscious, it could be nonlinear patterns, it could be magic, right? And how do we handle this stuff in a way that's trans-rational rather than pre-rational, especially in an age where the political and technological situation of the world might be um, unsettling people and undermining the rational achievements of modernity as consciousness. So I think there are a lot of factors in the world that will be increasing that will make the populations of the world um, more tribal, more anxious, more likely to reach for mythological and superstitious and magical patterns. And I don't think we can avoid that. And the question is, can we figure out how to do that well as opposed to doing that poorly? Can we figure out how to fold it together with reason rather than lose reason in a return to the irrational?
Yeah, beautiful. So these do map to some of the moves we reflected on in the fifth quadrant exploration. And one of the reasons and why I was nudged to bring this to you, other than you are the voice of the integral stage, and there was a gesturing of going beyond the four quadrants to this fifth space, was that the way I experienced many of the leading voices adjacent to the work you're doing and in the broadly described the liminal frontier, what I see is there is an effort to correct to the Cartesian fallacy, the myth of separation. There is an effort to correct to, sometimes, not always sufficiently, but an effort to correct to the reductionist, physicalist, scientific materialism. There is an effort to correct, even earlier on, to correct to perhaps New Age, mumbo jumbo, soft, wishful spirituality, which you just hinted to, that would be considered irrational and indeed just wishful thinking, and find a place to bring more transrational, integrated way of embracing elements that we left out through the modernity framework. And I also felt that there was an effort to correct to the hangover of legacy religious frameworks that were old. Now, when I brought to you the fifth quadrant, one of the balances or imbalances that I was seeking to address is that I feel that many of the explorations are still, even when they're gesturing to embodied practices, they're very heady, very high up there, very conceptual, and there is still a tendency to address those as a map making theory of everything kind of an effort, and that the problem with those is that they live all sorts of other lives that you just hinted to, those dimensions that perhaps are more difficult to map into the invisible, the intangible, the luminescent, and also the shadowy elements. So my concern is that sometime when I go for the ride of those meta on meta on meta moves, they sometimes remind me that we're doing philosophically a little bit of what was attempted to do over the last 2 decades in the business world. You had these platform companies competing, and in media as well, competing with who will become the aggregator of the aggregators. And you have a bit of that sense with who is going to integrate the integrated model of everyone else. And they go into sometimes second, third, fourth, fifth level of the abstract. And so part of why I brought to you the fifth quadrant inquiry was an attempt to respond to that, or to correct to that, to integrate more of the invisible, intangible, and those are those 12 moves. And my initial thought was, we will come back, we will do another exploration into, so what is holding us back from these frontiers? What are the deadening persuasions that prevent us from more fully liberating those? And then I thought we will go about developing a few of the moves, what we described there on that loom as move 10, the ensoulment move, and a few others. What has happened since was that we have been in a vortex of change, and dramatic wars erupting in more places all over the planet. And I have found myself in the last few months in the vortex of new work. We published something on portals a few months ago about this idea of the post-guru era, where there is an invitation for a more distributed way of looking at a communal endeavor. But actually, it did not say we do not need teachers. It said we need more teachers, more coaches, more midwives of evolution and development, but we need them in different ways, in different types, and not just aggregated around one singular voice. And actually, this week we're putting out a whole other very long article, which is a build on a conversation about the guru trap, well, the teacher's journey, the guru trap, and the golden shadow. So these are all nudgings that I feel they are arising inside the broader context of what you're describing as integrating these other elements that we left behind. So I said quite a bit there, but that's what I thought we were going to do next, and somehow I've been quickened into another set of exploration, so I feel in a slightly different space, and we may need to retrace to this, but this is why today I felt we could just explore where you are, where we are, where I'm with portals, and discover what is the sand drawing that is painted in front of us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to try to articulate with you and clarify what's actually alive in this field at this moment for us, even though I have a lot of thoughts about all of those issues you just raised and would be happy to discuss them as well. The thing that really leapt out at me was this problem of conceptualizing embodiment. I used to make a silly joke about the French, saying that the French think that they are very sensual.
Right.
Right, because we could get into this. We can use the idea of embodiment to substitute for embodiment, and it gets us close. We start to have the right conversation, but there's some threshold we don't cross when we're doing that. And I think what it takes is a return to the intensities of the body. Those intensities come up for us in various ways, right? If we look at it through the, say, Gurdjieffian lens, those are intensities of friction or of struggle between different aspects of the body and the nervous system. If we look at it through the shamanic lens, then we have the opportunity for ordeals of various kinds, especially ordeals that are situated in ecological circumstances, right? And these are sort of classic ways where somatic intensity takes you across that threshold that you might otherwise think that you're very embodied and haven't quite gone there because the body sounds very good, But when you have to actually undergo some kind of physiological intensity, it no longer sounds good and it's no longer an idea. It's something you actually have to be in and struggle with in order to figure out how to get through that and turn that into intelligence and into being.
So part of the bias that I think that is playing through this, and I love your reflection of the French and the insight it brings to embodiment. Another way I describe this is that some of those conversations they are simulational, if there is such a word in English. They become a simulation of what we ought to become and what we ought to do, but they run through, again, the conceptual mapping. And it strikes me that part of it is the fact that we are doing this through this medium of YouTube and conversations. Part of it is that there is a commercial bias and a communication bias that is nudging us to be compact and soundbite for the Twitter-like platform. And the whole drive of the last several decades was, if you can package your ideas in a somewhat elegant and precise way, you may get the platforming viral effect. And so that is part of the meta on meta moves that we've seen. And there is also the psychological dimension of it, is that it provides us with a sense of control, that we actually mastered all that we are talking about, and I don't know that we have. So those are some of the persuasions that I sense are nudging us into those directions. What are you finding that would offer a balancing and a corrective move for those obsessions with supposed elegant efficacy that bypasses certain work? Yes.
I think there is a lot of it being generated, as you say, through the fact that most of us are relating through digital media, which are themselves simulations. And yes, there is a lot of persuading built into the commercial ideology of the culture we all come out of, and especially of the social status and money necessities that are still affecting everyone, even though we're trying to do this new work. But I also feel like the social dimension itself has always been a bit of a simulation and a status game in its conventional aspect. And in the way that I phrase it to myself, I think of the shamanic characters as being necessary in village life to disrupt that, right? That the conventional layer of social reality in general always tends to have this element where there's conformity and simulation and a set of persuasion games. And that happens automatically unless somebody takes on the responsibility of observing and critiquing and disrupting that. But that person has to have certain temperaments, a certain neurological predilection, and they also have to have challenged those things in themselves. So they have to be good self-disruptors. And I think part of that, you see this where the shaman becomes the artist. You see a bit of that, where the artist is constantly, some artists, of course, agitated by the ordinary realm. And I think we need to welcome and emphasize that agitation. We need to be, I think, more bored with what we're doing, more unhappy with the way that nice conversations go in these spaces, more agitated, more willing to be creatively agitated by listening to big name voices speak very plausibly about important aspects of world transformation. We should be irritated by doing the things we've already done, because the things we've already done are only getting the results in the world that we've seen so far. So what I mean is there's a potential for certain people to play this role in the field, but they have to be willing to, and with a good conscience, be constantly unhappy with the nice way that things are ordinarily going. They have to be displeased at a socially appropriate gathering. They have to be, and I try to do this myself. If everyone says, "Oh, that was very wonderful, Layman," then I'm suspicious. I think maybe something has gone wrong if they're not puzzled, if they're not a little bit off balance, then I feel like nothing has occurred. But you need these people who specialize in and have a good attitude about the weird, about the uncanny, about the imbalanced. If you get a bunch of feedback from something you did, and the feedback is that no one was sure what was happening, that's very good feedback in the field, because the danger is that it smooths out and everyone can go, "Oh, that makes sense, and we're doing good sense making work together, and we're all on the right team, and we're helping the world go in the right direction." But to me, that the flattening and smoothing within that social field is where we get these effects anciently, even though they are amplified by economic ideologies, they are amplified by the technological media we're using, that they're very basically built into the way that human beings get along with each other. And someone has to disrupt that, but in a positive way, in a way that's good for us rather than just disruption for its own sake.
So you're describing a temperamental inclination, a set of capacities and capabilities, and a really an operating system in a person or in a gathering of people that will accommodate and support that and learn to live with that. We are creatures, human beings are creatures of comfort, and of the large majority of people, we seek to find the equilibrium rather than disrupt the equilibrium. So what are the archetypes that you see will lead and facilitate these kind of experimentations? Do they show up in who we have known as in the role of a spiritual teacher, elder, leader, or in a completely new kind and different kind of archetypes?
Hopefully, I think something new is coming into the world, and that we are collectively, as a distributed intelligence system, finding those patterns. But those patterns will resemble, and our efforts will be inspired by figures that we've seen before. Some of those figures are very ancient. The role of the shaman and the trickster goes back thousands of years in human psychology. I think the role of the spiritual teacher has always had a bit of a disruptive element to it. Even a very conventional seeming spiritual teacher, in principle, is supposed to disrupt the ordinary functioning of the human ego, of the limited form of psychology that we're using. And anyone who wants to help you grow, even cognitively, has to interfere with the equilibrium that you're currently protecting in yourself. So it's built into that. But I think there are figures, and we've talked about a few of them before. Like, to me, Gurdjieff is a very interesting figure, and he represents a subset of spiritual teachers who were also very artistic and also very post-conventional in their behavior, even to the point of generating strange moods and odd confrontations. I think there's also a way for us, coming back to this earlier question of how these leading edge communities handle problematic people. One of the ways to use people who seem problematic or disruptive is to have an attitude that we can benefit by their presence, even if it's someone who you feel is not been behaving well socially and stands for certain temperaments in the human being that we would wish to correct. That doesn't mean we should exclude them from these spaces. It may be that they have a role to play as provocateurs, as long as we, informed by that shamanic sensibility, have the feeling that we can handle that, and the idea that we're going to use it for something in ourselves, that we're going to lean into disruption. And the other thing I would like to say on that is, I think this is essential to moral growth. It's very easy for us to criticize each other for being immoral, as people do in the world, and it's very easy to play mind games of would you push the fat man in front of the train to save five children kind of exercises. But I think the real moral growth comes from inner frictions and disruptions, and it comes from a pain that you feel between your values and your behavior. And we have to be willing to embrace that pain in order to generate the energy that causes our moral growth. But that's an important subset of the general idea that we should be teaching each other to lean into these disruptions. And the people who can demonstrate the ability to do that and speak articulately to the need for that, I think those people historically tell us a little bit about this archetype, this new form. But there's a lot we're still going to have to discover about it together, because if it wrecks the sense making field that we're doing with each other, then it's no good. So it has to be a disruption that fits with and strengthens the organic web that we're generating in these overlapping new thought communities.
Where do you place in this evolving picture the currency of trust, the currency of credibility? Because when we talk about disruptors, there is always the question, so how will you build inside this transformative, disruptive transition set of agreements and ways of participation and collaboration that can be founded on some kind of a set of agreements that you can trust and that build credibility. I mean, in a completely different space, and I will like to later zoom more into mainstream and what's happening in the world and how what we are exploring here relates to that. But just to place next to what we are discussing now, in the coaching work that I do with people in mainstream business, in some of the largest companies in the world, one of the tool sets or mindsets that I offer to senior executives is I say to them, you need to be 4 out of 5 times predictable, 4/5 predictable to your people, so they know that you are there is focus, there is clarity of purpose. But if you are always predictable, they tune you out. So you need to have like the 10 or 20%, it's the 80-20 or the 90-10. You need some time to appear to be unpredictable. So you get them to be alert in your presence. What you're describing is a reversal. It's almost being 70 or 80% on the unpredictable, on the disruptive end of the continuum. And yet again, to build large scale systems, we need to build protocols of trust and credibility and credence in the system. How do you place these concerns inside the story you're telling about what we need to see more of?
I think the first thing to take seriously is that not everyone has the same role in a village, right? If we use the village metaphor, that 80% reliability is very important for a chieftain or a matriarch or a parent, whereas 70 or 80% disruption or seeming disruption might be appropriate for the shamans or the yogis or something like that. So we have to figure out sort of a division of labor where people don't feel like they all have to follow the same structure and pattern. You have to figure out which way that you can bring forward your best capacities in the way that's of greatest service to the collective. And that will be different for different types of people. That's the first thing. The second thing is to go slowly. I think trust underlies all of this, and it is a bit like having children, right? You need as a parent to challenge them, but the challenge can't exceed the supportive conditions that you've created for them. It can't actually dysregulate their organism. You have to, first of all, stabilize and secure them in many physical and emotional and psychological ways up to the point where they're capable of taking on that challenge. So the first thing we need is a stabilization with each other, which is partly emotional, partly physical. But I think the temptation, especially in communities where we are all very conversant with the language of virtues, is to try to jump to trust too fast rather than understanding that, I mean, we can come together in a big meeting with each other and all of us could affirm trust and new values and saving the world. But the actual trust is something you build with individuals bit by bit over time by experiments. It grows like a root system in a forest. You have to take that time and you have to experiment and you have to not pretend that you're trusting more than you actually are so that you can figure out what you actually have to do to both trust and be trusted. And I think we were discussing the simulation problem. It shows up here as well, which is a lot of people in the liminal space are very good at pretending to trust and be trustworthy. And then they don't really know whether they are or aren't. So they have to take the risk of going a little bit more slowly, I think, in order to figure that out. And then a third thing is, this comes out of my Buddhist psychology background, you have to practice the ability to have any particular emotion, right? It's happiness is not something that people are equally capable of. It's a kind of a skill. And then the same thing with trust, or the same thing with sorrow or grief. Your organism has to be capable of it, which means your organism has to be healthy and functioning well, but also you have to have repeatedly explored these emotional qualities and felt into their intensities in various ways. So I think the emotional quality of trust is something that we need to practice more individually, collectively, and as a culture. When we look at the broader sociopolitical situation in the world, there are many objective reasons to not trust the systems that we are embedded in. But we also have a personal responsibility to become capable of trust, because it's not just a response to what's out there. It's also a kind of a faithful act that we make in ourselves. But to make that act, we have to be able to generate the electrical frequencies and the hormonal chemistries in our organism that go along with that. And if we can't make the trust chemicals, then it doesn't matter what the external situation is. We won't be able to do it. So that kind of practice is important.
Yeah, beautiful. You're really making two adjacent moves. The interior proliferation of states and feelings and experiences and range of emotions and the capacity to embrace these as part of becoming a whole, a fuller, more integrated whole person ecology inside. And you're also inviting, in the sense of the village and the different roles and capacities, that there has to be a way of proliferating and liberating a greater diversity of roles. And when I ask myself, so why, what's holding us back? Part of what is holding us back is the old structural limitation on power distribution, and how in the older models power was concentrated mostly with one or two archetypes, the traditional leader figure, and that somehow relates to the economic model that still underwrites so much of what's happening in our world. I mean, we began with, or you began with, recognizing the role of the feminine. It's an ongoing conversation in our family, because my daughter-in-law is raising our two grandkids, and when they were here a couple of weeks ago, seeing what a mother with two toddlers' job is like, as far as I'm concerned, in the distribution of what you pay for, that like has to be the top job. If somebody ought to be paid $1 million, that role ought to be paid $1 million because they are, what can be more important than raising the future generation? But we run an economy where that is completely invisible, is not expressed at all in the economic paradigm. So it's an expression of how many potential roles and archetypes and capacities are not expressed because of the still locked economic model that we are operating in. And anything comes up in you in response to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I look at it in two ways. One is how we ultimately would need to change the economic models that we're in, and there's many facets to that. And then the other one is, well, what do we do right now because we can't necessarily change those economic models in the short term? So in the bigger picture, there may be many ways to do this. It may be that the use of digital tools and the creation of digital currencies will turn out to be transformative and will turn out to give us the ability to um, couple money to different forms of effort than we were able to do in the past. Because it seems like, in principle, every kind of effort should be paid. Um, but we haven't been able to do that. And of course, the people who have had outsized benefit from the existing systems don't want it to be that way. But that's also partly because it was difficult to set up a system like that. We may be able to set up new kinds of systems with new kinds of currency. It may be that we can draw the value of currency from different dimensions. I used to have this mental experiment called tetrabucks, which was, so in the integral model, there's 4 quadrants of meaning making. And I would think, okay, well, how could we make currency based on all 4 of those zones rather than just the zone of external negotiation? Right? Why isn't it the case that you have more? Why don't you have more money if you're working well in a community? Why don't you have more money if you're feeling better? Why doesn't the tree in the forest have value before you cut it down? Because if it only has value when you cut it down, it will get cut down. But if it has more value in the forest than when you cut it down, if you make more money by leaving it alone, these sorts of arguments. So there are lots of technological and conceptual ways to rethink how we've been doing economies, and we should be doing that. But that's not going to happen in the next 5 years or the next 10 years. So we have to figure out a way, not only for the general human community to survive, but for the people who are trying to embody new concepts, new consciousness, new values, new culture, for them to sustain themselves and not only thrive, be protected, and gain the influence in the world that money allows you, but template new forms of evaluation that we can then show to the rest of the system. I've been writing several articles on sort of transitional economics, trying to think this through. There's many possibilities, and most of them are experimental, so we won't know until they're tried. Uh, but broadly, the idea would be how do we, I think I called it, how do we make game A pay for the wall, which is how do we move currency to our project from the existing economic system, which we have strong critiques of. How can we, if there hasn't been this transition where we can pay mothers, or we can pay spiritual workers, or we can pay all of the people we know who are doing what seems to us to be essential work, if there's no direct payment for that, how do we set that up? How do we protect them? How do we make them economically stronger? Is it something where we generate supports? Is it something where we want to pay them for what they're doing? Or is it something where we want to generate money for them by some other means? If you see what I mean? Like there's this question of, do we as a community of people who are spiritual teachers, therapists, facilitators, experimenters, programmers, consultants, all these sorts of things, is that what we want to be charging for? Or do we want to set up ways to economically sustain all of us so that we can provide those things more or less for free? I think that's a very important question, because when we look at the groups that have tried to spread their values historically, those groups have figured out ways to provide it for free. I make this joke that no one would purchase the Book of Mormon, right? Unless they're giving it away for free, you're not going to encounter it, right? But that means they have to be generating their economic values somewhere else. It's a big
Yeah.
scatter of things there. But I think the main thing is we need to be thinking in terms of big changes, but also the transitional changes of making us thrive so that we can get to those big changes down the line.
You're opening what you bring to the arena is is the inquiry about the theory of change. Because there is a curious metaphor in business. I think it was in the middle of the 20th century that they developed this idea of skunk work. And the idea of skunk work was you'll take a team and you'll actually extract them out of the main operational focus of the organization so they can think long-term and be truly innovative. And largely it failed miserably because what happened was that they got disconnected from the mainstream business, and also they were locked in their own bubble and they did not create a feedback loop with the market. So this is really where I'm often involved with corporate teams. Do you lock the transformation agenda with a smaller team, or do you distribute the transformation agenda in everybody in the organization, and in a way you co-opt them or you engage them to create their own next horizon? And when we look at the more the kind of space we are now exploring, part of the theory of change is, do you need to go to another island and create some kind of an ideal version of a future, and that becomes the catalyst from which you communicate to the rest of humanity, which people throughout history have attempted to make that kind of a story? Or do you operate in the system with consciousness and capacities that belong into what you imagine is part of the future, and you become the imaginal cell through with which some kind of a transformation is emerging? What's underlying what we are struggling with here is the theory of change. And I suspect that no theory of change is going to be comprehensive. It's going to have to be some kind of a engagement of all of those, plus probably what is emerging now in the epochal story of humanity, the kind of crises that I mean, you can always imagine a global threat that's coming from outside of the galaxy that pull us humans together, even though you wonder, even if that happened, will we still quarrel our way through the solution? So the Noah Ark kind of story or archetype, what when you play these different scenarios that describe different theories of change, where do you integrate these in your mapping?
Yeah, my guess would be we don't yet have clarity on this theory of change, so that the best thing we can do in the meantime is try to make sure that the major theories of change we have are all being tried, similar to the way there's different roles in the village, that metaphor that I used earlier, right? We've got to have people working inside the current systems, but bringing a different sensibility and set of values and different embodiment to that. And we have to have people trying to template alternative visions, right? Both of those together, I think, is the minimum that we require. There might be several other major strategies as well, and I think we need their complementarity in order to try to approximate the actual theory of change that we haven't yet been able to clarify for ourselves.
When you wrote the meta-modern spirit, approaching transformative integration in psyches and societies, you began, your opening statement is, our meta-modern moment has come, the twilight of the gods is upon us. How did you mean this, and place that frame of mind in the context of what we've just been exploring?
Yeah, I think we're looking at a historical moment that's been coming for a long time, right? The notion of the twilight of the gods began to be used in Germany in the 19th century, particularly around Nietzsche and people like that who were already seeing and feeling that a great collapse of the inherited values was coming, that the disruption was already locked in. But what we're seeing now is an acceleration and amplification of I would say, the uncanniness of the world. And you mentioned this, this kind of 20th century fantasy that the world would unite if there was a great external threat. But that is only the case if we're all doing sense making in the same way. If everyone is getting a customized reality sent to their device, then even a real external threat is not going to bring us together. And one of the things we're sensing is that we are structurally not on the same page with each other anymore. And I say on the same page because it was pages and newspaper and books, which to a large degree gave us this sense that we had a common reality we were looking at. And in the digital universe, there will not necessarily be the sense of a common reality. There will be different kinds of network clusters who have different senses of what each thing that's happening means. So that's going to be one of the factors that creates this general mood of uncanniness that I might call the twilight of the gods. Right? There's been an undermining of the sense of a shared consensus reality, and that will be amplified by digital simulation problems, right? We're already in a situation where basically any voice, any image, any video, any reference materials can be rapidly generated by machine tools. That means the things that we turn to give us the sense of proof have been taken away from us. And the ability to automate persuasion has increased. So if you think of a situation in which all of us are living in an unnatural situation relative to where our bodies evolved. We can't trust anything socially we're seeing. We are peripherally aware of the fact that we're not experiencing the same reality. Then that's a world where sort of all the structure has been removed. Right? It's a deeply, deeply uncanny and unsettling place to be. So the structure that we might think of as being the world the gods constituted for us long ago, that structure has been removed. We're in Zach Stein called it the time between worlds. And one way to think about that is we're just shifting to a new system. But another way to think about it is that sense of being between worlds, that sense of the strangeness of transition may characterize us. It may be the flavor of the new world that we've entered into, a world where you can't do collective sense making in the old way. So that we have to develop new responses collectively for figuring out how to be together, how to be in reality. And in order to do that, we have to be able to sample lots of different kinds of perspectives and different kinds of reality tunnels, but not only sample them and acknowledge the plurality, not only go into the postmodern kind of consciousness, we have to be able to bring them back together in a way that is coherent and empowering. So that's the shift beyond the postmodern into the metamodern sensibility. And then we have to find spiritual analogies, inner practice analogies with ourselves, and social analogies for that process, and also technological and economic analogies for that.
There is a body of work that's been emerging over the last few years inside the Portals project, which we call the epoch transition or the epoch culmination, where we tell the story of the epoch through sevenfold natures, through the rainbow. But these colors, they mean something other than what they mean in the traditional integral framework or spiral dynamics or any other. They're describing recurring potencies and natures that are emergent throughout the epoch. And when I talk about the epoch, I generally describe it as the more than 3,000 years from, say, the collapse of the Bronze Age. And one of the ways we're describing this moment has about it the transition from the blue operating system, which is how we describe the collaborative modern structure. So this is why the colors are mapping differently to other frameworks. But where the Fukuyama moment of describing the end of history in the early 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, I'm describing that as his mistake was thinking that the epoch ended in blue. But in fact, what we've been experiencing increasingly since then is the increase of the indigo and violet transition. The indigo in that is a capacity to merge and integrate, which is why integral became so important in these last several decades. But that the violet dimension contains the other side of that same move, which is a release, a breakdown of all that was. So I'm describing part of that transition now as a violet transition. I've always been interested about the similarity of words violet and violence, because violence obviously is what I would describe as the below the line expression of violet, where the above the line nature of violet is transcendence and capacity to transform into configurations that were not possible or even imagined before. When you develop this article, you talk about, one way or another, you say a reckoning is coming. And again, this is a theme that's been around for several centuries, and one can internalize the idea of a reckoning through a Christian or Judeo-Christian framework, or through other frames of mind, and or some have been thinking about the reckoning that's coming very much through an economic paradigm and the dilution of currency and how the global economy is going to break down. What did you mean? What is the kind of reckoning that you're seeing in the context of this meta-modern moment, and how does it relate to what we are exploring here?
Yeah, I think the notion of a reckoning is often phrased now as the meta crisis. So I think we're looking at a reckoning that occurs in multiple dimensions of human experience simultaneously. There's a huge technological shift going on that we've barely begun to process, right? I don't think we've even really started to process the fact that we've separated sex from reproduction, and that was half a century ago. That we can have chemicals that allow you to have sex without babies, but we can kind of make babies in labs now without sexuality. Those things were closely tied together and drove the psychology of our brains for billions of years, and now they're diverging. And have we assimilated that? Not really, right? We have all kinds of new machines. We have the ability to not just change genders, but we're starting to be able to change the nature of species themselves. So these are technological changes that we haven't yet reckoned with. We've unleashed them, but we haven't internalized them. But that technological problem goes along with an economic problem whereby we've unleashed enormous prosperity, but we've unleashed increasing inequality in that prosperity as well. And at some point, that's going to have to be dealt with one way or another. But likewise, we've unleashed an undermining of our collective meaning-making structure that was pointed to, 200 years ago as the nihilism problem. And we've been arguing about whether we should go back to some established form of traditional meaning-making, or whether we put up with the lack of meaning, or we individually try to make meaning, or do we make a new religion or something like that. But all of that speaks to a collective psychosocial dimension of this. So there's many, many aspects, whatever kind of discipline or epistemology you can come up with, they're pretty much a crisis in that domain at the moment. And the experts in the domain say the crisis is about to get worse. And the crises come not just arbitrarily, right? I prefer a term like metacrisis to a term like polycrisis because they aren't, it's not an arbitrary cluster of crises that we're facing. They're all produced by a common set of drivers, which are the success mechanisms of modernity itself, right? That maybe the underlying problems are endemic to human civilization. Maybe they go back to the Bronze Age, maybe they go back to the apes, but they were really unleashed through the power of modern conceptual and physical tools. And modernity has been solving problems for us at an amazing rate, but it's been generating an accumulating set of side effects. And it can't fix those side effects because they're built into the success of its own functions. When it tries to solve them, it tries to solve them according to its own notion of success, which is what's creating those problems. We don't want to go backwards and lose any of the gains, but we have to reckon with the fact that the very instruments through which we are trying to solve our problems are generating another set of problems that are gaining on us very quickly. And that solution involves rethinking the basic parameters of everything we're encountering. So it requires a huge psychological and emotional willingness to move into the risk of taking that seriously.
We have exteriorized our power and our solutioning agency to technology, thinking that will solve everything for us. And that's been the trajectory we've been on over these several centuries. So what I'm thinking, Layman, is I'd like us to come back in the future and go deeper into the nature of the crisis and the kind of exploration that we are prodding here, including asking, what's the story we tell, what's the story you're telling in your mind about the function of this liminal frontier in relation to the mainstream, the other 83% or the other 99% of people that are not interested in all these ideas and are just essentially trying to cope with a chaotic world. And how do you place that? What I'm thinking will be useful and instructive is perhaps you can, before we land this, seed some of the earlier work that you developed into the metaphysics of adjacency. Just drop that seed and drop the seed about the surplus model and how those inform some of your thinking in the explorations we've nudged here, so that they become, in a way, the bridge for what we can pick up when we meet again.
Okay. In a seed form, the metaphysics of adjacency began as an attempt to think about what the metaphysics of a post-metaphysical era would be like. In the integral community, there's been this discussion about post-metaphysical spirituality for some time. And it's something that I worked on with Bruce Alderman and other people. And there's been a great discussion historically about post-metaphysics as well, that modernity felt it was post-metaphysical to traditional metaphysics. And then post-modernity said, well, modernity is not even going far enough. We need to question all of these things. But you can't do that in a vacuum. There's a certain implied ontological framework to having a post-metaphysics. So what does that look like? How would the world have to be if relativism and integralism, and to some degree non-dualism, are the way that we need to move forward together? And so when you look at it that way, you start to realize that what all those things have in common is a space between experiences of reality, right? That in a relativistic model, you have many versions of reality, and they're far apart, but they're acknowledged. And then in an integrative model, and there's many other ways to phrase that, you package them more neatly together, but you're still bringing multiple realities together. And in what I would call non-duality, or like complex non-dualism, you bring them so close together, you almost can't tell them apart, and you get the Zen koan effect. But you're still dealing with the same thing. You're still dealing with the interperspectival space between perspectives and realities and worldviews. And if we take that seriously, we start to think that maybe that is the original condition, or at least for people like us, we need to think of reality as being fundamentally an in between. It's not decided between which perspective. It's the in between space that allows perspectives to be related to each other somehow. And that form of thinking can be expanded. And you can start to go, okay, what if that kind of ontological proximity is taken to be the primary condition? Well, then you get very interesting results. You immediately get a removal of absolutism, right? You can say we can be closer or further away, but you can never be completely unrelated or completely identified. You take 0 and 100% off. It's all a gradient. And when you think of things as a gradient, it's very liberating. It frees you from a lot of dogma. It allows you to do sense making around multiple perspectives. And it also comports very well with the contemporary colloquial sense of talking in terms of sort of, almost, nearly, or putting things in quotation marks, right? That's a way of kind of taking it out of an absolutistic metaphysics and putting it into a space where everything's somehow approximate. And there's a fear that we might get that we lose the power of absolutes if we do that. But if we were to have a conversation that went deeper into the metaphysics of adjacency, we could explore why we don't lose the potency of absolutes when we shift to approximations. But essentially, it's a metaphysics of approximations and interperspectival space. So that's the metaphysics of adjacency part. And it has a certain rough similarity to the integration surplus model insofar as that's also a model of interaction between different sense-making systems. And when I was trying to bring together some of Gurdjieff's practical ideas with some of Ken Wilber's elaborations on what spirituality might be, which he lays out in the book Integral Psychology, I began to think about how what the integral map or any map that occupies a vision logic space is doing is charting the different kinds of basic experiences that an embodied being can have. And that by merging, bringing together, harmonizing, correlating those different realms of experience, you can produce something that is extra. You produce a kind of gestalt effect greater than the sum of the parts. And that extra is a very pragmatic way to think about what spirituality and religion are pointing towards. So we could say, I'm a spiritual person, or I'm having a spiritual experience if I'm connected to something that feels coherent and meaningful, but which exceeds my field of perception and thinking. And I could then generate or think about the mechanics of generating that effect that we often associate with peak experiences. And we can think about that personally as an effect that I could get by harmonizing different internal sense-making systems, such as heart, mind, and body, or left brain and right brain, or my masculine and feminine, my conscious and unconscious, or my chakras, if I want to use that metaphor. There's a lot of different ways to analytically break down an individual. But when you do that, you can then think about how to bring those back together. When you bring those parts back together and generate more than the sum of the parts, then your experience existentially becomes suffused with a coherent, meaningful phenomenon that exceeds your field of cognition and perception. And that changes you over time as you do that and becomes a navigational capacity you have as well. So this is a kind of spirituality seen through a constructive or productive lens. And then that experience can be interpreted in various ways. You could think of it as a higher self or an other being or just as an extra energy. You have options of interpretation. And when an individual does that, we can call that spiritual. Of course, we could use these words differently. But if someone says, I'm spiritual but not religious, I think they mean that they trust that the individual organism can do that, but they're not seeing a social correlate to that capacity. So the social correlate is what I would call religion or religiousness. And in the social correlate, you're not bringing together neuroinformation systems. You're bringing together some other sets of sense making that I would think of in terms of the general subsets of cultural activity, the classes of human beings and the genres of cultural inquiry. So when you look at religion, you might expect it to have the science of its day and the poetry of the poets and the mysticism of the mystics and also a political critique. And if you look at the great sort of Renaissance moments when the big religions were generated, you see that it did have a mixture of all those things. And this is also a very interesting way to think about religion because it enfolds science right into the definition of religion. We often put them in opposition to each other, but it's not the case that religion is non-scientific. Now, Christianity, for example, has been using an Aristotelian sort of Ptolemaic worldview for a long time, but that was the science of a certain period. So you could say then religion, when it's up to date in terms of the different genres of cultural activity, and when they're all being brought together and harmonized to create something that's greater than the sum of their parts, then a religion's actually working. It's actually functioning as a religion and not just remembering a time when it was functioning as a religion, because many of our churches operate a little bit more like museums that remember when people were religious. But when you have that, you then have an equivalent or an analogy to that individual production of surplus coherence. And the interpersonal production of that surplus coherence is a kind of spirit that moves between us. And that kind of language is used in all the great religious discourses, right? Where two or three of you are gathered in my name, there I am, right? When we're doing this thing together, we're actually producing this numinous extra, then we can point to a feeling that something divine, something that exceeds our categories and makes us feel empowered and outshines our perceptual and cognitive sense-making fields, is awake in us. And that gives us the sense that there is more, and it liberates us in part from the patterns that we are entrenched in at the moment. So sort of a corollary to this view where you have a productive spirituality for the individual and a productive social spirituality is that we actually need that at the social level, because we need to have more than enough feeling of meaning and more than enough shared spirit so that we can mobilize outside of the habits and structures in which we are embedded. And I think that's what the prophets have always called us toward. Right? Prophets don't come to non-believers and tell them to believe. Prophets come to the believers and tell them that they're not doing it correctly, that they've become entrenched in a pattern that is not actually accessing the spirit. And that we collectively, right now on this planet, are entrenched in a lot of patterns that are not accessing the spirit. And even though we know of many solutions to the various facets of the meta-crisis, we're not collectively mobilizing to solve those things. So we need an extra source of meaning and an extra source of energy so we can mobilize outside of our embedded patterns.
That was a beautiful and awesome distillation. And I think we should probably leave it there. I'll only say you mapped much that I believe we want to come back to. We want to come back to how the search of the new, whether it's a new religion or whether it's the new something else that will replace religion, how it emerges out of those inquiries and out of this sense and search of the surplus and the metaphysics of adjacency. I'm also equally interested to continue to explore with you, well, so how are these capacities and modalities, how will they express themselves in the classroom in a new updated educational system, and how do you translate those into what you started to describe as the new economic models, and certainly to circle back to the importance and the significance of the communal endeavor around this, in the sense of when a tree falls in the forest, when a community of people gather at the liminal edge, would Wall Street and Hollywood pay attention? And if yes, how? And where do you put these conundrums together, or do you believe that there is a nucleus that's being formed at an idea level, at a mimetic level, at an energetic level, at a spirit form level, and that in itself has its own natural propagation through the various structures and systems that you are connected to? There's much here to further and explore. I love the distillation and the summation you offered there. So thank you very much. Anything you'd want to close with through coming through this journey today? Anything you'd add in closing?
Nothing special, just that I've enjoyed it very much, as I always enjoy speaking with you. And I'm looking forward to conversations in which we unpack these ideas a little bit further. I think you're right that the question of education is essential in this, and the question of how people who are doing this new kind of work and this new kind of living are actually impacting or not impacting the rest of the civilization. And the fundamental inquiry that you keep bringing to this, which is what's holding us back? Why isn't it working better? How are we being obstructed in this process? I would like that thread to weave through all of our next conversations, because I think it's essential to all of this, because we could do a version of this that is amazing and doesn't do anything. So we have to be able to really be critical of what we're doing and of what's keeping our insights into transformation from becoming actual transformation. That's at the heart of all of these discourses, or it should be. So thank you. I appreciate that you keep bringing that in.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Layman. Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.